Our topic today, magic in Christianity. Guest is Robert Connor, author of Jesus the Sorcerer. His articles, The Romans Meet Jesus and Faking Jesus, are featured on thisinfo.com and Scribe respectively. We discuss the topic magic and the supernatural in the early church. We also discuss sorcery and demonology in the Greco-Roman culture of that time. So I was very fascinated with your article called Was Jesus Accused of Necromancy? And I've, just full disclosure, I have a master's in Jewish studies, and in our previous conversations we talked about how magic in different societies was, like they considered what the other groups were doing as magic and what they were doing as religion. And I heard an interview where you were discussing that as well. But the previous host of the show and I used to debate about how the Israelites' perspective on prophecy and even demonology was different than other cultures, and that can be debated. But the question that I have for you is, what are the, like, I know that in our previous conversations you talk about the similarities between the magical papyri and the different stories of the Greco-Roman world regarding resurrection and ghost stories, but is there anything particularly different that you see in the miracles of Jesus or the connection that he had from the Jewish world of that time from the other stories? Because we know about the similarities from our conversation, but do you see differences? Do you see unique ideas or ways of dealing with either the demonic realm or the spirit world that are not seen in the other cultures?
The short answer is no. I think that I see Jesus basically as a Jewish apocalyptic prophet from Galilee who establishes a regional reputation, first basically described by Mark, which I think all mainstream scholars would agree is the earliest of the Gospels, was probably written about, sometime after AD 70, after the fall of Jerusalem. So that puts Mark at least a full generation after the death of Jesus. So to begin with, we need to establish that the material that Mark uses for his gospel is not known, actually, and it is actually not knowable. So any reconstruction of where Mark got his material is necessarily conjectural. That said, Mark tells us that Jewish exorcists were already using Jesus' name for exorcism while he was alive. And the account in Acts about the sons of Sceva, which you're probably familiar with, talks about Jewish exorcists, 7 sons of Sceva, because 7 is a magical number, are trying to expel a demon and using the name of Jesus, and then instead of expelling the demon expels the exorcist by chasing them out of the house. So obviously that was a construed story to illustrate the superiority of the name of Jesus for exorcism over the names that Jewish exorcists were using. But if you look through the magical papyri, as well as stories in the legends of Solomon and all the rest of it from that general era, I think it establishes without any doubt that the early Christians, as well as Jesus, were basically referring to a broadly shared cultural understanding of the spirit world. The understanding that there are spirits basically pulling the strings the levers, working everything behind the scenes, which is how people in the ancient world generally understood things to work. Lacking physics, we have spirits. But yeah, the short answer is that no, I don't see any basic difference at all. And when you get up to the 2nd century and you're encountering writers like Origen, actually he would probably be early 3rd, he's basically writing in a work like Contra Celsum about the power of names. And when Jesus cast the demons out of the man in the graveyard and says, "What is your name?" "Our name is Legion." It was understood throughout the ancient world that in order to control a spirit entity magically, you had to use the name. Even the conjuring of ghosts in the magical papyri frequently supplies a name for the ghost to call the ghost up. So, yeah, I don't see any real difference functionally at all between the miracles and exorcisms of the New Testament and all the miracles and exorcism that was going on in the broader culture.
Well, you define Jesus as a Jewish apocalyptic prophet. So, to define our terms, the Israelites are known to have come out of Babylonian and Egyptian influence and then created a religion in contrast to those communities. I know that there's some things that are similar. Like in my research, I even found that the demoniac that the Gerasene demoniac that the spirit went into the pigs. There's a parallel in Babylonian religion where you use a kid or a piglet and you transfer the evil spirit into it, and you cut up the pig and you rub it on the body and stuff like that. So that's a connection. But so a lot of their writings were in contrast to the other religions or deities, also with the Canaanites. Then apocalyptic, you have groups like the Essenes or others who have this eschatological battle between the forces of light and the forces of darkness, and they're waiting for this final conflict that is going to show who are the true followers of God. But the most intriguing one is the term prophet, because I know the term prophet in academic circles has become more of a religious leader or someone with a big following, but the prophetic idea within ancient Judaism wasn't like most people think about foreseeing the future, but it was about convicting the public about going back to the ways of God. And then there was this thing that it wasn't ecstatic. It wasn't like people try to compare the prophets of ancient Israel with shamans and other individuals, and there's not that sense of being maybe there's a sense of being carried by God into the celestial realm or having visions, but there's not this idea of bringing it about yourself. Like there's this idea that God comes to them instead of them seeking God through roots or plants or mushrooms. So that was the debate that I had with my fellow host. This idea of it's always based on this kind of being sapped by God when they least expect it and having these revelations. So are you saying that although there's connection between the shamanistic and the other religions of the way they use the elements to bring about an outcome, are you saying that within the context of Jesus, was he tapping into some type of prophetic thing, or is that how his followers saw him, as having a prophetic utterance or a way of bringing people to their deity?
Well, that raises a host of questions. First of all, we don't actually have in the New Testament anywhere or in very, very few places in the New Testament do we have anything that any mainstream scholar thinks comes verbatim from the lips of Jesus. as I mentioned before, you have to start with the understanding, at least in mainstream scholarship. Of course, every evangelical will, or nearly all of them will, have a hissy fit about this question. But it would appear from the internal evidence of the Gospels that none of the Gospels were written by an eyewitness. And it's quite questionable whether any of the Gospels contain any eyewitness testimony. That can be debated endlessly, but no one has a way to prove it one way or the other. Second point is that the very earliest of the Gospels doesn't even get written until a full generation after Jesus' death, and, by the way, after the first Jewish-Roman war breaks out in Galilee, and the Roman troops work their way south to Jerusalem, surround Jerusalem, completely destroy it, destroy any number of villages on the way. So you can assume that if the generation that actually heard Jesus speak was still alive, they were either killed, many of them, in the Jewish war, or they left and they got out and they fled to surrounding regions, which is, what we would see in any war, even today in the Middle East, right? We would see devastation, and we would see masses of refugees fleeing for their lives. So there's no reason to expect that during the Jewish-Roman War that ended in about, 73 CE with the fall of Masada, that anything was different. So in the midst of this turmoil, it is very unlikely that we have any real eyewitness people left for the career of Jesus. If a person goes back and reads Josephus' Wars of the Jews, in which he sets out this entire history, and which is actually our primary source for this whole episode or this whole era in the Middle East, around the Second Temple Judaism, you will find that there were numerous people in Palestine named Joshua, which is basically, Jesus is just Latin for Joshua. It was a popular name. There were a number of these people who were prophets. And I tend to agree with you that instead of foretelling the future, prophecy at this time had to do with calling people's attention to a current situation. And I believe that there is a stratum of primitive material in the New Testament, particularly in Mark, that suggests that Jesus was a locally famous exorcist / prophet who was foretelling that the kingdom of God was going to be established perhaps by miraculous means. There have been a number of scholars who have suggested that Jesus actually went to Jerusalem to provoke a confrontation with the temple authorities on the theory that that confrontation would usher in the end, that it would be like a cosmic trigger, as it were, that would bring about the return of the Son of Man and the end of Roman rule, that the Romans would be driven out of Palestine, and that Jewish rule and sovereignty would be reestablished. And I think that's actually, I think that is almost self-evident if you look at the charismatic figures that populated Palestine while the Romans were basically grinding the Jewish people to dust and disrespecting their religious cultus. So in that setting, in the setting that is sketched out by Josephus in the Wars of the Jews, I think it is a figure like Jesus is not only understandable, figures like Jesus are inevitable. That is how an oppressed people at the time would logically respond to the intervention of foreign governments or powers, just like the Maccabees before had responded. So I don't think any of that is actually particularly debatable or even all that interesting given the background. Now the question is, what does prophecy entail? Does it entail possession? Does it entail losing your mind? Well, according to Philo of Alexandria, his writings on prophecy, and I cannot give you the book, chapter, and verse of where he writes this right offhand, but he has a famous passage to the effect, and I'm going to paraphrase him here, that when the Spirit of God enters, the mind has to leave. It's like he compares it to the sun coming up and the sun going down. So when the Spirit of God enters the person's mind, it's like the sun comes up and it drowns out everything. It blots out everything. And then when it goes down, then the person's rational mind comes back into play. If you remember the occasion of Saul going to look for David back in, 1 Samuel, where he goes to look for David, and he meets up with the prophets, and he becomes possessed and strips off his clothes and begins to rave. And I don't recall the Hebrew term, the verb, but the verb for prophesying and raving is actually the same term. If you look it up in a lexicon, it depends on the context whether you translate it prophecy or prophesying or whether you translate it raving. So apparently Saul went essentially bonkers, strips off his clothes. This kind of thing, though, is an opaque window, more or less, into practice, because when you look at the texts of the Old Testament, I think the consensus is that the textual evidence is preserving the temple cult and its laws, rites, and rituals. But then if you look a little bit deeper into the text, you will find references in Isaiah, Deuteronomy, of laws against, for example, necromancy. You find references in Isaiah of people sitting in tombs, spending the night in graveyards, presumably to get in contact with the dead through a very common technique anciently called incubation, where the person sleeps and receives information from gods or ghosts or whatever in a dream. This is typically how people got healing in the temples of Asclepius. They would go and they would sleep on a fleece, sacrifice a sheep, sleep on the fleece, and then the god would come to them in a dream and reveal what they needed to do to become sound of body again. So when you look at the textual evidence, there's always some question there about who's writing it for what purpose and whose viewpoint they're really representing. And I think it would be a mistake to become dogmatic one way or another about what counts as prophecy, what counts as possession. But no, I don't think Jesus was, putting his fingers to his forehead and pretending to see the future. I think that he saw himself probably very much in the role of an Old Testament prophet who is telling people at the time who are in distress what they need to know in order to escape that situation. Like the prophets addressing the invasion of the Assyrians or the Babylonians, or what have you. So yeah, on that point, I would certainly tend to agree with your assessment of what prophecy meant. The other thing about prophets, whether you look at Elijah or Elisha or any of the prophets of the Old Testament, is that they prove their bona fides by working wonders. They produce food miraculously. Elijah throws his cloak down and the Jordan River parts so that he and Elisha can walk across the river on dry ground. They foretell the future, not far into the future, but they hear things and they see things that are happening essentially contemporaneously with them. It's only up until about the book of Daniel, I would say, based on my non-specialist knowledge of that you start getting prophets who are seeing visions of beasts and the Son of Man and all that sort of thing that comes from the book of Daniel. But even the ancient Romans like Porphyry, who read the Jewish scriptures, knew that that was basically what is called technically a vaticinium ex eventu. It was a quote-unquote prophecy that was written after the event. And that's what you find in Mark 13 and the many apocalypses basically in the Gospels, in the Synoptic Gospels at least. They're vaticinia ex eventu. They are going back and making what actually happened a prophecy that comes from the lips of Jesus. And I think that's pretty much the consensus among mainstream New Testament specialists.
The reason that I brought this up is because the New Testament writers saw the followers of Jesus also as inheriting the prophetic gifts and the ability to perform wonders. And you see that in the book of Acts, and then you see, Paul talks about it regarding the gifts of the Spirit and things like that, but it's always in this opposition to the Greco-Roman religions. And I know that now we can look back and see the similarities and the connections and even the influences of the Greco-Roman world into the New Testament, but there was always that element of wanting to differentiate themselves. And Christian apologists would say that the real difference is whose power are they tapping into. There's a midrash that talks about the battle between Moses and Jannes and Jambres, the priest of Egypt, and that he was able to turn a snake, his staff into a snake by the finger of God, and they did it. Usually says through trickery, but they say that it was done through the power of the demons or the evil forces. So there's this conflict between, again, light and darkness and good and evil. Do you see that as a common trend within the teachings about Jesus, that there's always this battle? Because in future interpretations of the New Testament, they see Jesus as in constant battle with the devil, and instead of saying that Jesus was a magician or that was tapping into the demonic forces, is the other way around. He's representing God, and the Jews or whoever is around are the ones who are working for the evil one, and they're trying to trip him and stop him from revealing the power of God. Is that what you get from the original text, or is it true what I'm saying, that that's how it later got interpreted to fit their purpose?
Well, it's always the common denominator in this is that people in the first century believed that miracles were done by spirits. It was not a psychological explanation for them. So the question simply boils down to good spirits or bad spirits. And if you look in the magical papyri or any other source that comes basically from that era, the question of how this is done is always a simple answer. The answer is always spirits. So, with the exception of some very exceptional writers like Lucian, Porphyry, a few writers like this, and basically the equivalent of our skeptics from the first century, they would look at it and they would say it's all a bunch of crap. Okay, it's all trickery, it's fake, or it's delusion. And that's the way Celsus explains Mary Magdalene seeing Jesus in the garden after the resurrection. He said she's basically a wacko woman who is seeing things, and then from ancient testimony, it would not be at all difficult to find many stories of basically disturbed women who are seeing things. So Celsus had his point. And the Christians have basically, after about 100 years, come around to essentially the same thing. You have the Catholic epistles, pastoral epistles, I should say, of 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, talking about women who are gadding about the houses, house to house, talking up stuff that they shouldn't talk about, and they're loose and they're unoccupied, and they don't actually get accused of witchcraft per se, but they get accused of being basically busybodies with too much time on their hands and up to no good. So basically that becomes the Christian stance toward women generally, which was already the pagan stance toward women, that they were susceptible to delusion, they were silly, they tended to grab onto crazy ideas, so on and so on. So there's obviously a cultural thing going on there, but like I said, the common denominator is the explanation of spirits. So naturally, if somebody that you don't like is performing miracles in the New Testament, you never say, oh, well, that's just trickery. You say that's Satan. And that's the same thing going on today. Something happens that evangelicals don't like. What is it? It's a sign of Satan. It's the sign of the end. A hurricane comes ashore, and it's, the sign that America is falling into sin, blah, blah, blah. It's always there's always that explanation that is handy to grab onto. It's the only explanation that some, religious conservatives seem to have for anything that goes on that they don't like. And so in 2,000 years, nothing has actually changed in that regard. I've had this discussion on another program, and basically I say, religion is magic for the populace, and magic is religion for the individual, and that particularly becomes clear when somebody is dying. When somebody's dying, and all of a sudden the magic becomes personal, the religion becomes personal. I don't see any difference at all between magic generally and religion generally in the ancient world. Now, this used to be kicked around endlessly. There were like scores of people who wrote thousands of pages trying to delineate the difference between religion and magic. And my sense is that after reading a lot of that stuff and having one conclusion after another kind of fall by the wayside, the scholarly community has finally just given up on that project because nobody could make a case that somebody else couldn't basically shred. They couldn't come along and find examples or texts that turned the argument on its head. And so finally, I think that we've arrived at a consensus that for all practical purposes, there's no difference. It was just a difference in how people explained it, which spirit force they chose to use as an explanation. So if you liked it, it was from God. If you didn't like it, it was Satan. Just like today, there's no real effort to get behind it and explain it with anything else. That said, I think that if you read the literature that's available, much of it online, much of it free access, open access, on hallucinations versus visions, and people having paranormal experiences generally, I think it's quite an eye-opener. I think you will find that a very, very substantial percentage of people who, for example, have lost a spouse recently have episodes of either sensing the person's presence after they're dead, sometimes hearing them, and even sometimes seeing them as if they were alive. That's not, in fact, unusual at all, it turns out, through large surveys of people who have experienced death in their families. I think that there are some really detailed psychological studies where large populations of people have been surveyed that demonstrate pretty much beyond a doubt that there is a potential for a person to trigger a temporal lobe seizure in themselves, either through some people say it can be accomplished through rocking motions, the sort of back and forth motion of the body that you see typically with people engaged in prayer, particularly in the Middle East. It can be done through low blood sugar, which would result from fasting. It could be done through various types of other physical privation. It can be done in situations where the person is socially isolated, such as going out in the wilderness for 40 days and 40 nights, And all of these things can be used to potentiate hallucinations, visions, whatever you want to call them, and that these temporal lobe seizures, which have now been proved to occur scientifically with instruments that are able to record brain waves and flow of blood through the cortex and what have you, that these can be triggered, that the person can learn how to trigger them, that they are not accompanied by physical signs such as facial tics or generalized motor seizures where a person falls down, convulses, and what have you. On the other hand, there are a number of speculative articles that go back decades that look at the case of Paul falling on the road, seeing the bright light, hearing the voice of Jesus, that matches up with temporal lobe epilepsy that actually does progress to a seizure. And there is also a quotation in the book of Acts where Jesus is speaking to Paul and asks him, "Why do you kick against the goads?" or against the pricks, as some people translate it, which is a line that comes straight out of the Greek play, the Bacchae. And that's exactly what Dionysus says to Pentheus when Pentheus begins to resist the incursion of Bacchic religion into his area of Greece. In fact, there are experts on the story of Dionysus that can line up a half a dozen or more very close similarities, almost perfect parallels between the story of Saul's conversion on the road to Damascus and the play The Bacchae. And most of those people have concluded, these coincidences are way too many to be, accidental. This isn't just something that happens due to free composition. Somebody was cribbing off somebody else. And the play was very well known during the time that Luke, who quotes it, was writing. Luke was, it is generally agreed, a Gentile who would have probably, if he was literate, have seen this play or known about it. So yeah, I mean, it speaks, that whole thing speaks to several problems. First of all, the sources and how shaky we are in terms of identifying the actual source of many of the gospel stories. And it touches on the problem of us transporting ourselves back into that culture of really understanding a culture that's been gone for 2,000 years and taking their taking their viewpoint seriously, taking it as literally as they did. So, but like I said, it's hard to get dogmatic about a lot of this stuff because actually no one really knows. Everyone is on thin ice and speculating about this.
Well, I just wanted to say that the passage that relates to the finger of God is Luke 11:20, where it says that he drives the demons by the finger of God. And that leads to the next point. You mentioned the legends of demons in books about Solomon. The Testament of Solomon, a Jewish Christian text, kind of plays around with the idea of King Solomon having the ability to command demons and have them, he debates them, and then he has them help him, and he has control over them. So, and is the reason they call it a Jewish Christian text is because the version that we have talks about in some areas that Solomon did not fulfill his purpose, but Jesus came and finished the job, or things like that. Right. There's little apologetic things here and there, but what I see is that there is some influence from the Testament of Solomon to the New Testament and the other way around, because there's this idea that Jesus is greater than Solomon, that in the New Testament, and that Solomon had majesty and he had a lot of wisdom, but Jesus, being a lowly preacher, he has some gifts that are similar to Solomon, and the ability of being feared by the demons and having the demons respect him and venerate him. Do you see that again, if we were to compare demonic possession in other cultures and the way that is portrayed in the New Testament, there's this idea that he's cleaning house, that he's shutting down the works of the devil, and he even confronts the devil with scripture. So there's this idea that even though you don't see much of that in the Hebrew scripture of the Old Testament, now there's been a takeover by demonic forces, and he's coming to relieve people of that. And even in the healings that he does, there's this aspect of him driving out the demons or the unclean spirits and restoring people. Is that something that is unique to his mission? Do you see that also in other figures in the Mediterranean world?
You see it everywhere in the Mediterranean world. You have a Jewish exorcist actually producing evidence of an exorcism in front of Vespasian in one of the ancient accounts. Exorcism is going on all over, but as you point out, the Jewish people in particular had a reputation as exorcists, and so it was not at all out of character that Jesus, as a Jew, would emphasize exorcism. At some point, however, the suggestion is that exorcism becomes a problem for the church because it's all over the place in Mark. The more lurid details of the exorcisms are missing in Matthew and Luke, and there are no exorcisms recorded in the Gospel of John. Nothing about exorcism in the fourth Gospel, which is written at the very end of the first century, beginning of the second, somewhere along in there. In the Gospel of John, in fact, you have a movement away from Judaism. In the Gospel of John, for example, the Jews, which recurs over and over and over and over again, is basically shorthand for the enemy of Christians. The Gospel of John has become exceedingly anti-Semitic, if you will. We have Jesus in, I think it's John 6, telling his followers, unless you eat the flesh and drink the blood, or eat my flesh and drink my blood, you won't have everlasting life. You can't imagine anybody who is an observant Jew telling somebody to drink blood. I mean, that's like nuts. You would have to know essentially nothing about the Levitical law to have somebody who Jewish say something like that. And it shows you how far away from the sources we're getting even by the end of the first century. We have the Jewish mother church in Jerusalem has been destroyed, along with everything else. The main characters of the earliest church, James, Peter, Paul, they're all executed probably by AD, 55, 60, somewhere along in there. They're all gone. Then the Romans come along, fight a war, scatter everybody else. In the meantime, the Christian communities are mostly in Asia Minor, in Alexandria. They're in Egypt. They're in Asia. They're not in Palestine anymore. Then we have another revolt, and actually Jerusalem is renamed Aelia Capitolina, and Jews are forbidden to even enter it except once a year under Hadrian. So you might say that the Jewish aspect of Christianity has faded almost to oblivion by the end of the first century, and the Jewish flavor of Christianity has basically is eradicated by that time. So, yeah, I mean it's very hard to reconstruct all of this. But if you look back at it and you think about how much has been lost, I think it's pretty clear that we're talking about a tiny percentage of the data that was once there that has survived down to us. And then touching on your point about, the Testament of Solomon, Odes of Solomon, all of these Solomonic, this material that has come down to us, you have to think about who copied this and then copied those copies to keep these texts alive after the fall of Jerusalem. I mean, who dominated the religious world after about the 3rd and 4th century? Well, it was Christians. So Christians had to have some kind of interest in these texts for these texts to even survive down to our day, right? And they had ample opportunity to insert their own spin, as it were, into these texts. I mean, they were the caretakers of these texts. And they had more than enough opportunity to tweak, the message, as it were.
Well, going to your article, was Jesus accused of necromancy? You talk about how, the one passage that I always found strange was the Transfiguration in Mark 9:5, where the only other example of someone who's dead coming back and speaking to people, or at least appearing to them, is the one of Samuel with the witch of Endor. So now you have Jesus on top of a mount, and there's apparitions of Moses and Elijah, and even though they don't say anything, there's this idea that a cloud came over the mount and they felt God's presence. But could there be an interpretation or a scenario where he could be accused of conjuring up the spirits of the two prophets?
So he can't confuse Jesus with John the Baptist because the context of the gospel shows, first of all, that the career of Jesus and the career of John the Baptist overlapped. Herod, in fact, was the one who was responsible for throwing John in prison and having him eventually beheaded, at the same time that Jesus is still gathering followers. So it's clear that Herod knew John the Baptist, and he at least knew of Jesus. According to, I forget which gospel it is, Jesus, after his appearance before Pontius Pilate is sent over to Herod to satisfy Herod's curiosity. So Herod is clearly aware that these two individuals are out there, and he's obviously going to be aware of them because both of them are drawing crowds. That's one of the other things about John the Baptist. It says that people went out from all over the place to see John. And then when Jesus comes along and begins performing healings and exorcism, the Gospel of Mark starts listing all of the places that people flocked to see Jesus. Finally, to the point where, according to Mark, Jesus can't even get in his own home because there's such a crowd of people around. Now, considering that Herod is a client of the Roman state, and that the Romans want Palestine to be peaceful so that they can, conduct business, collect taxes, which is what they're ultimately there for, is to extract wealth from, the colony. Herod is obviously going to be aware of who's who in Judea and Galilee. He's going to have probably informers who are going out with these crowds to keep an eye on these prophets, since we know from Josephus that the Romans fairly frequently hunted these people down and killed them when they got too much popularity and they were gathering too much of a crowd. It made the authorities nervous, and they would squash them. So there are many reasons to think that Herod knew who John was and knew who Jesus was, and that when he raised the question about Jesus' powers, he was suggesting that Jesus had raised the ghost of John the Baptist. And this is a pretty old speculation that goes back, I think, to the Journal of Biblical Literature back in the 1920s or 30s. It was actually written up by a professor at Yale at the time.
Well, you quote Carl Kraling. Is that the professor from Yale?
Yeah.
My question about that is that, let's say that he was doing it by the power of John, or he brought John back. John is not known either in the Gospels or in the outside sources as having any miraculous or...
Right, for performing miracles. Right, I know, yeah.
So he's seen as a harbinger of the Messiah or as a prophet. So how is he doing stuff by the power of John the Baptist, other if you can claim?
Well, see, and that's the problem, isn't it, with the redaction of the Gospels, because if John is supposedly coming before Jesus with the power of Elijah, who was a major miracle worker, right? Probably one of the greatest miracle workers of the Old Testament. Then all of a sudden, John has no miracles to perform. Now, why would that be? I mean, you don't have to think very hard to figure out that if you're trying to promote Jesus and you're trying to demote John, which in the Gospels we have John's followers coming to Jesus after John is imprisoned and asking him, are you the real thing, or do we expect somebody else? And Jesus says, what? The blind are seeing, the lame are walking, blah, 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 blah. So obviously the writers of the Gospels do not want John out there performing miracles hand over fist, because that detracts from the reputation of John. They want John to simply be the guy who announces, behold, the Lamb of God, the one coming after me. I'm not even worthy to tie his shoes, blah, blah, blah. So that is obviously all just essentially apologetic BS. You wouldn't think that John would be much of a prophet like the prophets of the Old Testament if he had no miracles to perform. I mean, that wouldn't make any sense given what prophets do in the Old Testament. The whole point about raising the ghost of John the Baptist that Kraling brought up, to his credit, is that, first of all, John fits the categories that make a powerful ghost. And those are basically, he dies before the natural end of his life. He dies violently by execution. So those put John into two categories that we know of that fit him to become a powerful, restless, resentful ghost. The other thing that's interesting is that when Matthew retells this story and Luke retells this story, they change it. They have Herod just like so confused, he just doesn't know, like what's going on here? You know, I have no idea how Jesus gets this power. Matthew has John, interestingly, beheaded, and then has John's disciples come back to Jesus to report that they've taken away the body. So the part of the ghost lore from the entire Mediterranean world is that if you chop up the body or you disfigure or mutilate the body in some way, that it tends to disable the resulting ghost. The Greeks were so afraid of this that if a person was murdered, the murderer would sometimes cut the limbs off and string them around the neck like a gruesome necklace. It was called maskalismos. So on the theory that if you cut the guy's legs and arms off, then the ghost will come back without legs and arms, so what can he do? And there's some theory out there. Some people have had the opinion that maybe the reason that the whole story about Salome getting Herod to behead John and having his head on a platter is to basically make him, is to cut the head off the ghost. So that possibly to, and again, we're speculating here because that's all we can do given the evidence that we have, possibly to prevent John from becoming an effective spirit, come back to be called up from the dead. But the fact that ghosts were called up from the dead to accomplish magical ends, magical purposes, is all through the magical papyri. That's not even a question from there. So I think that Carl Kraling was onto something. I think that he made a very good case at the time, and I think that the material that has come to light since he wrote makes it an even better case, which is what I argued in my essay that put up online. That essay, by the way, has been adapted to the chapter of a book that I'm writing at the moment called The Ghost of John the Baptist, because it gives you some background as to how spirit manipulation was thought to occur back in the time that Jesus lived. You know, obviously edit that story to change the brunt of it. I think that they were probably aware of the interpretation that Mark reports Herod having put on it. But that said, if you look back at the Old Testament in terms of its prohibitions against necromancy, against consulting spirits, etc., magic in general, it's hard to explain why you would need those prohibitions if there weren't actually something out there to prohibit. In the story of Saul going to the witch of Endor, obviously Saul in the story has already extirpated as much of that sort of necromancy as he can from the land, according to the Old Testament, and yet he's able to find this woman. I mean, everybody it's an open secret. Oh yeah, if you need a person to raise somebody from the dead, we know a lady down in Endor, and they go right to her. They don't have to look around. So if you look at the official report of any religion, nothing much is going on. If you look at popular culture, on the other hand, a lot is going on. I mean, how many Christians are reading horoscopes? I mean, there must be a lot of them, because horoscopes, are pretty much a feature of every newspaper, every magazine. We have call-in shows, where you can call in and get your cards read and what have you. We have palm readers, and we have tarot card readers practically every 6 blocks here in Sacramento, where I'm living. There are probably nearly as many of them as there are churches. So clearly, something's going on the popular level that is not reflected in the official history or the official view of the religion. So people are living on 2 different levels. And it's quite possible that Jesus or anybody else was at least accused of having power because he raised a ghost. Since John was a popular person and was now conveniently dead, and somebody was asking, where is Jesus getting all this power? It would occur to Herod that, he raised the ghost of John the Baptist, and that's what's working in him.
So, but it connotes that John had power to begin with.
You would have to assume that John had powers to begin with, or at least was a popular person who had charismatic power, at least at the very minimum, the power to draw very large crowds who went out to hear him preach. So one way or the other, John was clearly a powerful individual. He was an apocalyptic individual who was preaching, the axe is laying at the root of the tree, watch out, the end is nigh. The fact that Jesus went to John to be baptized suggests that John was a powerful individual. Why would Jesus feel the need to go get baptized by John? And I think that when the Christians were confronted, the gospel writers were confronted with this fact that Jesus was apparently started out as a disciple of John the Baptist, and probably even after his death, John probably had followers. He probably had people who still, believed in him, who still respected him, likely right in Jerusalem or right in Judea. Here's another Jewish group, because the Christians didn't start out as Christians. They started out as a Jewish group in Jerusalem. They have followers of John the Baptist to contend with. How do you explain to followers of John the Baptist that Jesus was more powerful, that he was the one that was actually foretold, not John? That John was just the forerunner, that John's just the announcer who opens the show, so to speak, and that Jesus is the main act. Well, you downplay you downplay John, and you elevate Jesus at the same time. It's a situational response, which is basically what everything in the Gospels is a situational response. It's a response to what's happening at the time that Gospel is written, what the controversies are, what individuals the Gospel writer is hoping to address, both supporters and critics.
Well, let's talk about Matthew 11:18. There, Jesus said, "For John came neither eating nor drinking, and they say that he has a demon." Mm-hmm. And then in your paper, you contrast that with the passage in Luke where Jesus is accused of being in league with Beelzebub. I had never thought about that passage about him being called a demon, and then you quote Jennings and Liu, who say that in some sense what they're really accusing Jesus is being a commanding officer of the power of Beelzebub, or in other parts of your paper you say that he was using Beelzebub for his purposes, that Jesus had like some type of stronghold on Beelzebub. What can you explain that for our public? The writer Lucian, who was extremely skeptical about
exorcism and about magic in general, talked about driving out a demon with the help of a more powerful demon. Or to quote Lucian, he called it driving out one nail with a bigger nail. When the church historian Eusebius got around to talking about some of Jesus' competitors, he talked about them in terms of using a powerful demon to drive out a less powerful demon. So this was a common accusation or a common metaphor in the case of Lucian, driving out one nail with the help of another. The thinking is, again, going back to that common denominator, everything happens because of spirits. If you're going to get rid of a demon, the way to do it is to enlist a more powerful spirit, which in the case of people critical of Jesus, it would have been logical to say he has Beelzebub. In other words, the Jewish leaders who come down from Jerusalem to see what's going on in response to Jesus' miracles. And their conclusion is he has Beelzebub. In other words, he has a very powerful demon. He has the ruler of the demons, and he's using the ruler of the demons to drive out lesser demons. Then when Jesus points out that people are saying of John he has a demon, why would they say John has a demon if John was not doing any kind of powerful works? They would be using that to explain miracles, wouldn't they? Isn't that how you explain miracles? You have a spirit. You have a spirit helper. It's either the spirit of God or it's the spirit of Satan. But you can't perform miracles on your own. You have to have help from the other side. So if there was an accusation out there rolling around that John had a demon, it would imply by saying that John was doing something so powerful and so uncanny that there would seem no other explanation than to say John has a demon. Then when Jesus comes along and begins to do something even more powerful, more uncanny, the explanation would be, well, he has a more powerful demon. In other words, Beelzebub. So he drives out demons by the ruler of the demons. So to have Beelzebub in this case, and there are actually apologetic scholars who claim, well, see, they're accusing Jesus of being possessed. So no, as Kraling pointed out, that's not at all what they're accusing him of. People who are possessed don't control demons. Demons control them. It's actually quite simple. It was very simple to the more literal minds of the first century. If somebody had power over someone else, then obviously they had a higher rank. They were higher up in the pecking order, which is why, in that article that you cited, when Jesus talks to the centurion, and the centurion tells him, I want you to cure my servant, my boy, however you want to translate the word, Jesus says, well, I'll come and heal him. And the Roman centurion, obviously a Gentile, says, well, he understands, or Matthew understands, that Jesus can't come into a Gentile home without becoming unclean ceremonially. So he says, well, just say the word. And then he explains, because I tell the men under my command where to go, and they go, and when to come, and they come. They follow my orders. So he's assuming that Jesus has control of spirits. All he has to do is tell them, do this, and they go do it, which is exactly what we find in the magical papyri, basically word for word. It's almost as if it were cribbed right out of the magical papyri. And for all we know, it could have been. I mean, the person who wrote this may have been familiar with this whole magical technique. It wasn't like some kind of state secret. And they could have written the technique in there, not even necessarily deliberately, just knowing that, okay, this is how things are in the spirit realm. This is how we do that. And they would just produce what is a very widely known cultural norm, a cultural story.
Are you familiar with the background of Beelzebub? In the book Essentials of Demonology by Edward Langton, he talks about how it was the local deity of the town of Ekron, and then he mentions in the book of Judges there's a king that goes and sends a servant, or he goes to find healing after falling from a ladder from that deity. And the question remains, after the return from Babylon, there's really, I guess you might find sources about this, but there's really no evidence of idolatry, or I guess you can say when people were involved with the Greco-Romans during the Seleucid kingdom and that, but this idea of Jews being chastised by God because of idolatry is not a common thing to happen. So another interpretation would be that they are talking about demons, but what they're really talking about is that he is using the power of another deity, and that he's somehow a pagan, or he's performing miracles by the god of Ekron that ends up being Beelzebub. Are you familiar with that?
Yeah, not specifically. I mean, if you look at, the only response I would have to that is that if you would look at the magical papyri and other similar texts, the world of magic is intensively syncretic, so that people pick up the names of all kinds of deities, the Lord of Hosts, all of these typical titles of Yahweh from the Old Testament find their way into the magical papyri, some of them in fairly corrupted forms. And you also find lists of deities, Greco-Roman deities, all sorts of deities, the various names attributed, the epithets attributed to the God of the Old Testament, all kind of thrown into this salad. The idea, I suppose, being that the more names you put in there, the more chances you have of getting a magical hit, because the name is how you control it. If you know the real name of the demon, of a god, then you use it for magical use. It's available to you. It's like a lock and a key. You have the key, you open it, which I think is probably one of the major reasons that the Tetragrammaton was not supposed to be pronounced. It was because if you could pronounce it, then bingo, it's yours. You can summon up Yahweh, you can control Yahweh because you have the name. So tracing these names of various demons back, well, first of all, presupposes a number of things. It presupposes that the material is being accurately reported in the Gospels, first of all. It presumes that the Gospels are being accurately transmitted to us through the process of copying, which is an open question, because most of the Gospels that we have, the first full manuscripts of the Gospels, we don't have until the early 4th century. So you've got a lapse here of at least 100 years before we have very much evidence as to what was even in the Gospels. And the people copying the Gospels are not aware, apparently, that they are copying quote-unquote scripture. They're altering the Gospels according to authorities like Eusebius, according to writers like Origen. They're making changes in the Gospels in response to criticism of the Gospels, which is probably why, like I mentioned, there are no exorcism stories in John, and why the whole raising John the Baptist changes, each story changes from Mark to Matthew to Luke, and is not mentioned at all in the Gospel of John. So it's kind of hard to to be specific about where some of these ideas are coming from. Then we also have the problem that only the tiniest fraction of all the possible material that we could have had in the first century has survived to the 21st century, survived unchanged. So we're making, when you look at the Gospels and you read these things as a literal transcription of something that happened, you encounter a lot of ifs, ands, buts in between, which is why, like I keep saying, the reconstruction of these events is extremely tenuous, it is speculative, and very hard to get dogmatic about. My argument is that based on everything that we know since Carl Kraling published, and it refreshed my memory, I don't remember, was it 1920s? If you've got the thing in front of you, I don't have it in front of me. But in all of the stuff that has come to light since the 1920s, all that material argues that Carl Kraling was probably as close to right about this as anybody's going to get.
Because, whenever we hear scholars or researchers bring up issues like these, it always goes back to some of the so-called accusations of the Jews against Jesus, such as, witchcraft or in league with Satan, and there's contention if Jews even believe in Satan or the devil, and then people finding things in the old versions of the Talmud or in the legends of the Jews and then running with them. So the real question is, this idea of Jesus being either possibly a necromancer or a magician or a sorcerer, are these independent ideas, or do they come from these accusations that the people of his time did not believe him and thought that whatever he was doing was from somewhere else? Because I feel that it could fuel more anti-Semitism. And if you look into some of the websites that are out there, they're always looking for reasons to attack the Jewish community, including giving people reasons to doubt the message of Jesus.
Yeah, I appreciate your point there, and I would say unequivocally and categorically to anybody listening to this program that pagan writers were very clear about making accusations of magic against Jesus and the early Christians. I mean, it's basically every pagan critic that has survived, that any of their writings have survived, make the accusation specifically of magic against Jesus and the early Christians. I mean, Celsus, Porphyry, Julian, the so-called apostate, all of these writers were quite specific about accusing early Christians of sorcery. I mean, that's basically universal. And Christian apologists for the first 3 or 4 centuries are constantly having to defend their religion against being compared to magicians and to sorcerers. So to the extent that the Jewish people identified Jesus as a sorcerer or magician, they were hardly alone. In fact, they were definitely a minority, all things considered. But if you think about it, now going back again to my common denominator of everything is done by spirits, if you were going to suggest that somebody did miracles, and yet, because nobody claims that Jesus didn't do any miracles in the ancient world. His Jewish detractors, his many pagan detractors, never claim that Jesus did none of this stuff. None of them claim that, oh, this never happened. They all claim that it was done by magic, because that's the only available theory, right? Everything has to be done by spirits. So if a person you don't like, you don't approve of, you don't agree with, is doing something that appears magical, then it has to be by a spirit. If it's something that you don't like, it's an evil spirit. If something you approve of, it's the Spirit of God. It's basically that simple. But yeah, I appreciate your concern there, and it's quite likely that Jewish writers had to go through their material and do some, deletion of accusations, since that during the Middle Ages, a lot of their writings came under the view of the Inquisition and similar bodies. So yeah, I mean, I'm sure that the Jewish people could have said lots more about what they thought about Jesus, given an opportunity to speak freely.
Well, a new thing that has been coming up is this idea of a mythical Jesus, and they'll even say that there was other figures that were either put together to create a messianic figure. Sometimes they even quote the Talmud, because in the Talmud is a very complicated work, and it has some things that seem to be polemical against Christians, but it's kind of garbled up, and sometimes they don't get the story to be the same as the Christian narrative. So there's different characters and from different periods, and they kind of mix up the stories. So they'll look at that and they'll say, well, maybe that's what happened in the New Testament. Maybe there was different messianic leaders that people were attracted to, and then after the destruction of the temple, they decided to create this religion to either appease the Romans or to spread some type of message, and they developed this mythical character with all these powers and all these abilities. Do you see any merit in that theory? And can anybody dismiss the historical data, or see it as people are debating about it, someone that never existed? Is that even possible?
I really hesitated to jump into that, but following the release of my book, Jesus the Sorcerer, one of the major figures in the mythicist movement, Richard Carrier, actually mentioned my book and Morton Smith's book and dismissed them as a completely faulty interrogation of the text, etc., etc., in spite of the fact that the idea that Jesus was a magician or understood to be a magician is actually pretty widespread in the technical literature on New Testament studies. Most people are not aware of that, but there were articles coming out as far back as the 1920s about the accusations of Jesus being a sorcerer, and the first full-length book that I know of by Hull came out in the early 1970s, and there have been a steady stream of books since then that have examined that question exhaustively. I've done 3 books myself on that subject generally. The whole idea of mythicism is not new. It's about 100 years old. It started in France. The idea in what I call hard mythicism is that Jesus and the whole story of the New Testament, everything about it, was basically made up out of whole cloth from similar material from the Greco-Roman religions. And then it was kind of peppered and salted with quotations from the Old Testament to make it look like it was Jewish, basically, in background. But it was basically derived from dying and rising gods and, atonement and all that sort of thing that was already present out in the Greco-Roman world, Egyptian world, generally. I find that thesis to be almost certainly wrong. I finally broke down took about a month or so and wrote a piece that's up on Scribd that is basically pretty much open access to anybody, called Playing Hide and Seek with Jesus. I take what I call the soft mythicist position, which is typical of virtually everybody in mainstream New Testament studies, is that, for example, the birth narratives, the infancy narratives of Matthew and Luke are almost certainly completely fable, made up from nothing or close to nothing. There's no reason why a peasant coming from some tiny village in Galilee, there's no reason that anyone would know anything about his childhood or even care what year he was born or what the circumstances were. So this is all backfilled after Jesus becomes the Christ. People are making this up, and people are making up infancy gospels all the way into the 2nd and 3rd century, so that's not surprising. I consider that probably 50% at least of the material in the New Testament relative to Jesus is either taken out of context, probably because the context wasn't even known at the time or remembered at the time the gospel was written. So yeah, there's a lot of just made up stuff, fable if you want to call it, legend, whatever, in the gospels. But I find it very hard to believe that Jesus of Nazareth was not a real person. If you read, again, I would just tell the interested listener, go back, find Josephus' War of the Jews, and just read it. Don't read it for the material about Jesus specifically, because there are some passages in Josephus that allegedly mention Jesus and describe him, and those passages have been debated back and forth for centuries about whether they're genuine or whether they're interpolations that were just stuck in there by a Christian copyist where they came from. Just ignore that. You don't need it at all. Just read the whole Wars of the Jews about the political, messianic, prophetic, charismatic, whatever you want to call them, figures that popped up in Judea and in Galilee during the Roman occupation, what they said, what they did, what happened to them, and John the Baptist and Jesus completely fit in with those figures. I mean, there would be nothing surprising about the career of John the Baptist or Jesus in the light of Josephus' Jewish wars. I mean, they would have been almost a cliche. They would have been so common that the Romans were just nailing them up like shingles to get rid of them. So nothing about it, the claims of miracles, the promise of a kingdom, none of that would have been exceptional or strange or unusual. I mean, that was just the grist for the mill of a people who were being ground down and immiserated and basically subjugated by a foreign power. And that was the religious and political response. Not that there was, in the Jewish mind, any difference between politics and religion, as you know. So, yeah, I'm aware of that. The guys that put this out, Robert Price is one person who has advocated this position. Richard Carrier, as I mentioned, is another. I find the position of total mythicism, what I call hard mythicism, I find that extremely hard to believe. And I would emphasize to your listeners that no matter how much press that gets, that is a very, very tiny minority opinion among even skeptical people who have studied the New Testament. I can't think of a recognized New Testament historian off the top of my head who believes that or who has advocated for it. And I'm fairly familiar with most of the mainstream New Testament historians and their work.
Well, like you said about necromancy and other magical stuff, that it the reason it's brought up is because it was happening. Like, what I find hard to believe is that someone would go through so much work to describe the territory where he lived, the people that were there, the authorities, the certain individuals. That I know there's problems with some figures that maybe they weren't real or not, but it just seems like a very elaborate story to make out of thin air. And then the question is, for what purpose? There's another book that claims that it was Josephus who was hired by the Caesar at that time to come up with the story.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm sorry. I find that. Yeah, I find that. Yeah, that's to me that's a real reach. But look at legends generally. I mean, look at the incompatible infancy narratives of Matthew and Luke. They're full of details. Full of details. Who went to who said what, where they came from, what they brought with them, what they did later, da 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 da. Like I said, I think that the mainstream opinion on the infancy narratives in New Testament studies is that they are at least a minimum 90% legendary. That none of that stuff happened. Or you take Luke, the angel appears to Zechariah when he was serving his round as a priest in the temple, and he said this about his wife, and then this happened, and something else happened, and then she said all this stuff about Mary, and the baby jumped in the womb, and da-da-da-da-da-da, and all this stuff is, I mean, this is all legendary. I mean, who would know anything about the son of a manual laborer in Nazareth, which is a city so small that there are some people even dispute the archaeological claim to have even found it. I mean, Jesus comes as a man of almost no importance, who originally comes from a village of absolutely no importance, and yet somebody was writing all this down about his infancy. I mean, to believe that is borderline crazy. But having said that, the accounts are full of color and emotion and detail that for centuries Christians accepted as just, that's history. That's exactly how it was. Apparently no one ever asked themselves, who would have recorded this history? Where would this history have possibly, been sitting around, like a photo album or something, a diary? If you consider that very likely the people of that era, that 90% of them minimum were illiterate, who would have been jotting this down? Was Mary taking notes or something? Or was it, an angel that was saving this on tape, and then, when it came time 70 years down the road for the Gospels to be written, suddenly this all appears and it's all conveniently there? Or did they just make it up? Look at any legend. Look at the Greek and the Roman legends. The Egyptian legends are full of all kinds of interesting detail and particulars and, names of people and places and exact conversations. Think about the conversation that the Jewish leaders are having in the Praetorium with Pilate right before the Passover. A Jew couldn't go in the Praetorium. None of Jesus' followers would have gone into the Praetorium, into the presence of Gentiles, made themselves ceremonially unclean for 7 days and not been able to do Passover, right? So how did they know all this conversation that supposedly took place between Jesus and Pilate and the Jewish leaders and Pilate and all the rest of this? Where did they get all this information? How did they know that? Whether it was a court stenographer, writing it down, and then it became public record? I mean, when you look at the where this information could possibly come from, you hit a wall. It's like, how would the people who wrote this down 70 to 100 years later, how could they possibly know the word for word, content of these conversations? It's just simple things like that, simple questions like that, basic stuff that makes the typical New Testament scholar who is looking at these documents critically step back and say, okay, wait a minute, a lot of this is not totally adding up.
So with that in mind, how do we discern what could be possible to have happened and what was fabricated?
You have to go with probability. I mean, that's a pretty easy question for a historian. Any historian will tell you go with probability. What is the most likely thing to have happened? So when you hear hoofbeats, you look for horses, not zebras, right? So what is the most likely explanation for this story, for this document? Is there a historical core? Which I believe there is. I believe we don't know much. We probably know for sure, if you want to use that terminology, maybe a half dozen things about Jesus. That we could pretty much say, yeah, this is very historically probable. Nobody can prove it. I mean, if you look at evidence from the past, you've got basically three lines of evidence, as I see it. You've got forensic evidence. You can go back and you can dig up a body. And even when you dig up the body, it doesn't tell you anything more than maybe the sex and the age, and maybe the state of their nutrition. Unless you dig up a body, an intact mummy from an Egyptian tomb, and you have the inscriptions and you have everything else, then you can pretty much determine this is that person. In other words, this person existed. This is forensic evidence. You might even be able to extract DNA from that mummy, compare it to other mummies, and say, yeah, these people were actually related. You would have forensic evidence that you could take to a modern court of law, and you could say, yes, we can identify this person by name. This is this person. We have none of that for anybody in the New Testament. Nobody. And we never will. We will never find any forensic evidence for Jesus. Shroud of Turin or anything else. It's not there. So what are the other evidences? Well, we have textual evidence, which is what we have for nearly everybody that we know about in the New Testament. The evidence is textual evidence. It's on paper somewhere. And then it was copied, recopied, and finally, some of it made it down to the present day. That's the kind of evidence you have. And then the other you have what is called spolia in archaeology. You have archaeological evidence. You have inscriptions. You have actual tombs. You have monuments. You have whatever. Because of spolia, we know from an inscription that there was a Pontius Pilate. There was actually an inscription made during his life, and they recovered it. It had been built into another building. Somebody had used it for building material. That's how important they considered it. But yeah, we have that. But proving that there was a Pontius Pilate doesn't prove anything about whether or not there was a Jesus, much less anything about the New Testament. It proves nothing whatsoever about the truth claims of the New Testament. So, looking at this evidence, you have to go the way any typical historian would, and you go by what probably happened based on what we know happened to other people in that era. What probably happened based on what we know happens all the time, and supposedly has always happened and always will happen. We are pretty sure the sun, regardless of what Joshua says, the sun never stood still, which would involve basically stopping the rotation of the earth, okay, which we're pretty sure that never happened. And we are pretty sure it never will happen for many reasons. And you can look at miracles in the Old Testament and New Testament on the same basis. Has that ever happened in our experience? Do we expect that it ever would happen given what we know about physics, about natural history, about anatomy, physiology, what have you? What are the odds? And that's all you can do historically. You can say the odds are overwhelmingly that such and such a thing never happened, or the odds are fairly good that this happened. And on that basis, how much of a dogmatic argument can you possibly make?
So when you talk about Lucian and other critics of Christianity, by rebutting the story of Jesus, is it were they fighting ghosts or shadows? Like, just because someone comes and says, my Savior was born 200 years ago and he brought salvation to all humanity, does that give enough credibility that that was a real thing, or is it just a group of people who could have made up a faith based on loose ideas?
Well, there's no way to know, but I can tell you that there were all kinds of savior religions and savior cults all over the Greco-Roman Mediterranean world. I mean, saviors, prophets, visionaries, a dime a dozen. I mean, there were literally hundreds of them. Lucian writes about a guy named Peregrinus Proteus who briefly became a Christian and kind of milked Christianity for what he could get from it, and then ended his career by throwing himself into essentially a bonfire at one of the Olympics and self-immolated, and then predictably within hours was supposedly seen walking around all dressed in white. Yeah, I mean, none of these stories about saviors and savior cults and savior figures would have been at all uncommon any time in the Greco-Roman world. I mean, the Caesars were supposedly capable of healing people by touch. I mean, everybody who was anybody had these mystical powers. So why wouldn't Jesus? And Lucian is basically skeptical of all of them. He has a delightful story called The Lover of Lies that talks about a symposium where people are sitting around telling ghost stories and magical healing and all this sort of thing. And it's interesting to go down through it and read it and compare it with material from the New Testament. I mean, it overlaps again and again. He even mentions 3 categories of people who are likely to become ghosts. I'll give your audience just a second to think, what could those be? Well, it would be a man who was crucified, or a man who was beheaded, or a man who hanged himself. So basically Jesus, John the Baptist, and Judas fit those categories, right? So it's been speculated by me, including others, that maybe Lucian was familiar with one of the Gospels, and maybe he was having a little fun at Christian expense. Maybe by the time he wrote, enough people had heard the story of the Gospels that when Lucian did a public reading or a public performance of The Lover of Lies, everybody kind of, it was an insider's joke that was shared by so many people in the community that, like today, you can go to Saturday Night Live and somebody can make a reference and you get who they're talking about without them having to name it.
Are you familiar with the idea that part of the construct of Jesus being the Son of God and like begotten by God comes from some type of polemic against the Caesars, that since Julius Caesar had declared himself God, that then there was like the Jewish version of that, and now you have someone who's actually taking the divine right of the kings of Israel and Judah to the next level, where now you have someone who's actually representing the true God as compared to someone being divino philus from the Roman side.
Actually, if you read the New Testament closely, Jesus becomes the Son of God on 4 different occasions, depending on who you're reading. If you're reading Luke, he becomes the Son of God at his conception. If you're reading Mark, he becomes the Son of God, it's announced when he's baptized. By the time you get to Paul, Paul says distinctly in Romans, he was declared the Son of God by his resurrection from the dead. If you read the Gospel of John, Jesus has always existed because he's part of the Godhood. I don't know where we get Godhood. It basically the Godhead. It basically means Godhood. It means belonging to God, the group the Trinitarians call God. So even the New Testament shows that there is an evolution in thinking about when Jesus becomes the Son of God. The later you go in terms of Gospels, the earlier Jesus becomes the Son of God. So working backward from John, he's always been the Son of God. He was there at the beginning. So he's always been that. If you go to Paul, it happened at his resurrection. You go to Mark, it happened at his baptism. You go to Luke, it happened when it was conceived.
Well, you forgot one. He becomes the Son of God when he's crucified in the book of Acts. He's adopted as the Son of God.
So, the New Testament itself doesn't even have a consistent picture of when Jesus is the Son of God, which is why, as I mentioned before, this is all ad hoc theology. This is all being made up in response to where believers are at the moment these books are written, what their understanding is at that particular time. So you've got a bunch of little snapshots that shows a progression of ideas. So, yeah, you could speculate endlessly about this, and believe me, people have. If you go back through the technical literature, you could take, say, the most fundamental, outstanding religious journals about Judaism and Christianity, maybe the top 10 or 12, and go back from the beginning of their publication, in some cases a little over 100 years ago, all the way to the present, and read back through them, scan them, and I guarantee you will find the most amazing difference of opinion and differences of interpretation and fights that have gone on for 100 years over maybe just one verse. People actually becoming rather bitter and exercised about what the meaning of this verse is. And then, like I said, it's all speculative. You have no way of going back and asking anybody who knew where it came from, what it meant.
Well, in the last minutes of our show, I wanted to ask you about in the Gospel of Mark. There's a passage where Jesus is being confronted by the Sadducees, who are part of the Sanhedrin, and there's this question about him coming in clouds of heaven and sitting at the right hand of the power. And they were saying that the power is kind of like a Galilean way of saying God, that is kind of like a respectful way in the Jewish religion. But there's this idea of, are they truly accusing him of blasphemy for saying that, or are they just kind of, if you were to build a case against Jesus, and if the first thing is that he was a necromancer, and the second one was that he was in league with Beelzebub, and then you keep building it up, and in Mark you don't see that conflict as much as you see it in the book of John. But what was the final outcome of that type of conflict that he had with the authorities? Did you see it? Was it building up as him claiming to be related to God in some way in the first gospel, or is it more of a a leadership and authority issue.
No, no. Yeah, I cannot imagine that Jesus, the Jewish person who said that if you disobey any part of the law, you will be the least in the kingdom of heaven. To me, that sounds like a completely Jewish, basically Pharisaic position to take. I mean, to me, that makes perfect sense. That Jesus is 100% Orthodox, what we would call Jewish, observant through and through, completely. And if you start from there, then Jesus claiming to be God would be nuts. Okay, that makes no sense whatsoever. And if you look through the Gospels to the passages typically quoted to prove Jesus' divinity, I think it's very easy to demonstrate that there is a theological progression. There's an evolution of thinking that basically ends up kind of manifesting itself as what would be called apotheosis from the standpoint of the Roman emperors. And it's not so much that the emperor per se became a god. It was the idea of the numen, or the spirit of the emperor as head of the Roman state, was divine, which was, again, totally in keeping with the understanding of rulership basically all over the world, right? So, yeah, and looking at that, it's very hard to come down with a hard and fast opinion on it. But I would say that if you look at it, it evolves until finally, by the time of John, Jesus is still kind of not. In Greek, it's very hard. Well, it's hard to explain it to capture in English what John 1 verse 1 says in Greek. But I think the general belief of the hardcore grammarians is that John is not quite saying that Jesus was God, but not quite either just using the adjective that would be translated divine. So he's pushing the envelope almost to the point of saying, yeah, Jesus is God. And then there are some other parts of the Gospels and in Acts where, based on the grammar, it could be that they're calling Jesus God. By the time you get to Ignatius, who writes 7 letters that we still have in the early 1st century, he is definitely calling Jesus God in the flesh. He talks about Jesus' blood as being the blood of God. I mean, by that time, the identification is like 100%. You see Jesus, you've seen God, period.
Well, and the last thing, I became kind of aware of the idea that the Church of the Nativity is the same place where Syrians and I guess people in ancient Palestine worship the god Tammuz, and then there's a connection between Tammuz and Adonis and other deities. It was kind of eerie to hear about how the women would lament his passing by wailing, and that he was born from a myrtle tree, and I guess that was Mithras. I don't know. I get confused because that's another case that is built that is a mythical Jesus, because there are connections or similarities from other deities. But is the Tammuz one to be taken seriously? That there was some type of influence, at least of the Shrine of the Nativity and where it was placed?
Yeah, that's hard to say. I wouldn't put a lot of weight on it, quite frankly. I believe it's been pretty well established, but a lot of Christian shrines and churches are built on pagan holy sites. The Vatican is actually built on the top of an old pagan cemetery, which a lot of people don't know. I didn't know it until fairly recently. Yeah, I mean, if you're going to displace paganism in the minds of common people, people who are not into theological argument, people who cannot read and write, how are you going to do that from a missionary point of view? You're going to take their sacred sites and either destroy them, which is why so many statues and what have you from the ancient world are defaced and broken up, or you're going to supplant them, almost literally, by building your temple on top of their temple. Because as you probably are aware, a lot of temples in the ancient world were the sites of previous temples. So there was, temple 1.1 and 1.2, and they kept building the temple to the same god in the same place because the place itself was considered to be holy. So if I come along and I'm a Christian missionary and I want to figure out a way to convert these people, at least nominally, to Christianity, and I don't want to just march them all down to the river at the point of a sword and tell them, get in the water or die, I'm going to figure out ways to make my holidays coincide with their holidays so that Samhain in Northern Europe is going to become All Saints' Day, right? And, the winter solstice is going to become Christmas. It's just a matter of just moving my stuff into the place where pagans who were people who were previously pagan are used to seeing events and physical places.
Okay, well, we would like to thank you for your time. It's always intriguing to hear more about your research, and I was wondering if you could send me a copy of Myth versus History, Playing Hide and Seek with Jesus. I try to open it up on a script, and you have to be a member and all that.
Oh, yeah, I'll see if I can't. I've got a copy. I can email it to you, certainly.
And that's something that we want to discuss here in the show is how people run with their ideas, and like you said, they might become very popular, but that doesn't mean that they are being scrutinized or that they're being faithful to the sources. So we appreciate your research, and whenever I read something from you, you translate the Greek or you give us the sources. I think that's very important for people to be able to read it for themselves and to actually follow along with your premise. So we want to thank you again for coming on the show, and looking forward to talking to you soon.
Certainly, you're welcome.